Hello, everybody. This is Sean Pacheco, aka Watery Aquarius, and this is a podcast that I filmed with Brandon, aka Bramstrology, on Saturn. All about Saturn, the cycles of Saturn, like your Saturn return, your Saturn square, your Saturn opposition, and what ages do these events happen, and how to manage and cope with these times of our life in the best way possible. So this is our perspective as professional astrologers who are taking a fresh look at Saturn. This podcast was really awesome. I think that it has some very helpful content and helpful tips and metaphors to understand Saturn in a different way and what to expect with your Saturn cycles coming up. So keep watching.
My intention for this podcast is to help people understand Saturn a little bit more and learn how to manage these stages of life that Saturn throws us into. What's your intention?
So a lot of what I'm trying to do with Saturn, because it's something very similar to you, where it's something that people are very scared of it, very fearful of it, because they kind of see it coming down the corner, in a way, and they kind of have these experiences where they're anticipating like an absolute terrible thing. And as someone who went through my Saturn return during COVID, it was something that, yes, it was hard, it was very difficult, but it obviously grew me so much as a person. And I think after being done with it, there's so much that I look back and I'm like, I want to remind that to people and allow people to see, just wait till it's done. It's okay. It's going to be fine. So it's very similar intention. I think for me, I get a lot more conversations with clients because I don't do as much online stuff as you do, but I have a lot in person that are really worried. And they're like, what do we do? How do we look at this? How do we understand it? And I think a lot of what helps the clients that I've worked with is the kind of understanding of those Saturnian kind of cycles and kind of reframing the way that people look at Saturn too. I think that's a big part of just reframing astrology, because I think there's so much fear around it because we don't understand it. It's how do these things in the planets affect us, so intimately, right? We can feel them, we can sense them. And during our Saturn return, it's and you could probably agree, it's a visceral feeling, you're I feel it in my bones. Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a lot. My intention is just really to help, just much like yours.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. And so we chatted about introducing Saturn, and so I guess we could just dig into how we explain Saturn to individuals. Sure. I guess I can, and we're gonna have different, perspectives as different astrologers, but I think it'll be really cool for us to share and see what that looks like. But I do want to start with one key theme of Saturn, which is boundaries, right? Of course, but here's a metaphor that's going to clarify that a little bit. And I did hear this from Chris Brennan on the Astrology podcast, a really, really, really old podcast. I started listening to them from the start, from episode 1. Okay, yeah. But one metaphor that came up was about Saturn and the difference between Capricorn and Aquarius, and how we could look at Saturn as the boundaries of a city, the walls of a city, right? And Saturn's about doing what is expected of you, following the rules, traditions, customs. And so we could look at these two Saturn ruled signs, which are Capricorn and Aquarius, as parts of the city. So Capricorn is going to be inside of the walls of the city, working in society, taking care of their responsibilities, doing the work, doing what's expected of them, not experimenting too much, not taking too many risks. But then we see Aquarius, and Aquarius is the sign that's on the outside of the walls of the city. Aquarius was associated with exploration and almost, I think, other worlds and traveling to different worlds, different lands. And so Aquarius goes on these journeys and these voyages to experience the world, get these ideas, and then bring it back to inside of the walls of the city, to redefine, the rules and to progress society a little bit more. But I think I love that metaphor because it really shows, how Saturn plays into Aquarius, also plays into Capricorn, and how they relate. So I think when I think about Saturn, I think about what walls that we put up in our life, and how do we go outside of those walls, or how do we stay inside of those walls. And I think, what do you think about Saturn? How do you explain it?
Yeah, I first of all, I love that. I love that analogy. It's a really cool one. I never heard that before, and I think that's a really unique perspective on it, which is also very Aquarian, which I can expect. But I think there's also like kind of to go off of that as well. Like in a similar vein, there's a lot of time with Saturn Capricorn, Saturn Aquarius, we see Saturn and Saturn signs, right? And Saturn does really well. I was talking about this with a client actually, where Saturn does really well in Earth and in air because it rules Capricorn and Aquarius. And a lot of those things are accomplishments. And Saturn rules accomplishments. It rules like the long-term goals, long-term like things that we work towards. And Capricorn is this like cardinal Earth, right? Like kind of the epitome of like career, right? It rules that stuff. So it's this like earthly kind of success, right? A lot of like just getting earthly stuff done, whether it's financial, career, reputation, or just like a new form of health. A lot of the time Saturn, can also be related to just like feeling old and being like, now I have to like, take care of my skin better. I have to do, certain various things. And so that's a lot of what Saturn is kind of tends to give in that way. But then also on the air side, I feel like it's more of like the accolades and the societal like relationships, right? We have like new relationships during our Saturn return. We have those boundaries, like we work on creating those. And it's like both creating boundaries for like the work that we do and what we want to do and what we want to accomplish, but then also boundaries within like interpersonal and the information that we understand and what we're capable of like really bringing into society in an intellectual way. And so I tend to really speak on it in a way of just like, Saturn is something that you're meant to learn. It's also a lot of what you're here to do, like grounded into that. And you don't have the time or the context always to know exactly what that's going to be until really that Saturn return. You have some context, but and obviously the natal chart can tell you those things, but it's kind of knowing during that Saturn return, you really get to see it and you live it and you feel it. And it's like oh yeah, I feel this weight is either increasing or decreasing, and there's a lot of shifts and it's just kind of going through it. So yeah, that's kind of long-winded way, but that's the way that I kind of look at it. I like to kind of take that fear away from people too. So
yeah, and I mean, I think it's also important to be real that Saturn is not fun. Saturn is a malefic planet, so it's really going to push you and expect a lot out of you, and it's going to push you for the better. And that's really only something that you can see in retrospect.
Yes.
After your Saturn return, like you said, like you're like, wow, I went through all of that. I learned so much. I'm a totally different person. I feel more solid, as an individual, and so it's something that you look at in retrospect. But I think with Saturn, another way I like to look at is structure, right? But it's when we think about when Saturn is in Aries, we rush through that structure. We don't take the time to say, okay, we need to do all of the particular steps to achieve that goal that we want. And Saturn just says, okay, let me just go for it anyway. And then they get it, then it falls apart very quickly, or it doesn't have like a lot of that structure. And so I think Saturn can talk about like the steps that you have to take to accomplish certain goals, which are not easy. We look at Saturn steps on like a stair, on a staircase. The higher you climb that staircase, the more tired you get, the more exhausted you get, and it's like, and that's that Saturn energy. It's like it's pushing you, and you need to get to the top, but you need to take those steps to get to the top. You can't rush
it. Yeah, agreed. And it takes time to really get to. That's the biggest thing. It takes time and patience with yourself. And I think during the Saturn return, I think it's something that, and you can attest to this too, absolutely, because you're currently kind of in it, is it feels like it lasts forever. And it's like this, like every day is like so much more weight and so much more serious. And I think it is something that Saturn has a patience for you, and it helps you. And obviously look into what Saturn sign and house and all that stuff, which we're not really going to do, but that's going to give you more context of like you said, like if it's Saturn Aries, that's a lot of like doing the impatient thing, and it's like Saturn's like, no, you have to wait, And so I think there's a lot of waiting and a lot of when is my time, when am I doing this? And typically during the Saturn return is when that really shifts, and typically during Saturn cycles or prominent Saturn stuff is where a lot of that like hard work really pays off, because you're not really knowing what you're really supposed to do on this earth. Really prior to the Saturn return, you can kind of have an idea, but then when it really reaches that kind of nexus point, that like middle, like rebirth, right? Because if we think of Saturn cycle as like a new moon, full moon cycle, right? At that new moon of the Saturn return, it's really like, okay, now I'm setting these new intentions. I'm starting this new thing. And I wanted to do this new thing, whether it's relationship or career or, accolades or anything like that. So I think Saturn it's a fun energy. It is. A lot of people are terrified of it, but it's something
I feel like you enjoy the Saturn energy more than me.
Oh, I definitely do. I definitely do. Yeah.
And we were talking about this. I feel like you're a different type of Saturnian than I am. I'm like, I know what the boundaries and the rules are, but I'm gonna just not do that thing because stuff that I'm working on, my therapist expects that trauma, so I welcome that chaos into my life.
Yeah,
but,
no, agreed.
Yeah,
it's all about, I think with me, so Saturn for me has a lot of, I really didn't resonate with it fully until like really my Saturn return, and I really just feel like there's a lot more of a responsibility now that I feel like I kind of have, because that's another thing. Saturn also rules like responsibility in that process, and so a lot of it for me now is like, okay, now I'm responsible for like the younger generation, or I'm responsible for more of the impact. And I think that's why Saturn, it gives you that, and it gives you that sort of like gift of like, okay, now you're the wiser one. Now you're the one that is meant to kind of lead that structure for the next generation, whether it's Saturn in Pisces or anyone else that comes after. And that's something that I think is it's like we set the new foundation, and it just kind of keeps building like the building blocks, and like we all kind of can do it together. And it's obviously dependent upon like your Saturn sign, your aspects, what those things are going to kind of play out. But it's something that I really like, just being like a role model, right? And obviously prior to the Saturn return, I was just kind of like doing all this stuff and not really knowing, right? And typically during that moment, you're like, okay, now I know what I want to do. And sometimes you get put in situations where you have to be the responsible one. And then you just want to help people. That's really what Saturn also does. It wants to be that like authoritative help. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so let's just give a summary on Saturn. So Saturn, how you look at it in your chart is how you respond to these key things that we talked about. How do you respond to responsibility? How do you respond to having to do hard work? How do you respond to boundaries? How do you establish structure in your life? How else would you summarize Saturn in your chart?
In my chart?
Well, no, and just in general.
General chart? Okay, like in my chart. Well, in general, I think it's something that it does a lot to do with autonomy. I think a lot of it too is that moment that a lot of older people speak about, where it's like you really are like, I'm the one that's responsible for my life. Like it's that autonomy, it's that self-responsibility. It's that kind of like, I've been responsible for everything that's come up to this point, and I can choose to either maintain that, or I can choose to let that go. And it's about that restructuring. And I think it's something that going in with the foresight of, okay, this is a Saturn return. This always happens for people around the age of 28, 29, all of those things. Going in with that information, I think, is so valuable, so that you can have people that are more well-versed and more experienced or wise to just like guide you. And so I really think that overall, it's just a lot about autonomy. It's a lot about responsibility. It's a lot about trusting yourself and trusting your role, what you're here to do. Because a lot of that is kind of shown during the Saturn return too, as you go through it. So it's really fun.
Sure.
That's why I said I like it.
Yeah.
I've developed a good relationship with Saturn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm getting to know Saturn.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, it happens. It happens. Yeah.
But when I talk about, and we'll talk about the Saturn return, but when I had my Saturn return, I felt like Saturn returned to me.
Oh yeah.
Like it was a more internal realization and changes, and I thought it would be like very external. And of course, my Saturn return was very external, but it was almost like I made these choices. Like I was working with Saturn to say I deserve better.
Absolutely, and that's where the boundary part comes in, and that's where the like expectation of yourself. And sometimes with Saturn return too, it can feel like this, like, or just Saturn in general, it can feel like this, kind of like what you were saying with the stairs, where it's like this never-ending kind of staircase of just like draining, like I'm going through this, like what is going to actually happen? What's the purpose of this? And then you realize in that moment, like, okay, this is, and it starts coming together, and you start realizing it, and you start coming to some sort of, more groundedness. And that's another thing. It's very grounded, and it can be humbling too. Like if you're doing too much, it can kind of say, take it on the brakes, slow down, be more frugal, be more intentional. There's a lot of intention with Saturn, and it makes you realize that every step prior to that can definitely, it does matter 100% every step you make. But then when you reach that point of realizing you're the one responsible for it and that realization, then you start taking it more seriously what you're doing, and kind of taking that patience with yourself and others, and however, that came for you. So yeah. I think when it comes to misconceptions, it really is that fearful part of it, or also too in the same part. I think a lot of people with the Saturn, especially Saturn return, when they look at it down the road, they think that everything's just going to be amazing. They don't have to do any work, and it can definitely be something where it's like, no, you have to put in that work. So there's a misconception sometimes that Saturn will literally give you that if you've done a lot during or prior to the Saturn return. But then when you reach the Saturn return, it's almost like there can be a sense of entitlement that you go into it with. And then Saturn can kind of be like, no, you still have to keep doing this thing, and there can also be a misconception, obviously, with the fear aspect. But I think there is also the other end of like it being privileged. Like, let's say you have like a really amazing Saturn in the 10th house, or really amazing Saturn in like a really amazing alignment, right? Then you're expecting this amazing, phenomenal thing with no effort, but you still need to do effort. I think that's something that people can think about if they have a really well-placed Saturn, where they're like, oh, it's going to be fine, right? I had someone, one of my clients who was really into astrology. He was like, oh, you have Saturn in the 2nd house, so when you go through your Saturn return, you're going to be super rich, right? And it actually was the exact opposite, but it was richness in a way that is very different. It was, for me, I have Saturn in Aquarius and it's in the 2nd, and I'm very rich in like the social avenue, like in the network. Like my network is super rich, but my own resources I went from making, like $4,000 a month to like a quarter of that. So it's very different. It can kind of go in different ways. Like obviously I went into that a little bit like, oh, like I'm going to do really well. I'm going to have all this stuff. And it went in a whole different direction. And so I think, knowing what I know now, it's richness is something that, at least for me with my own Saturn return, is something that is like these, like conversations, topics, people that you can like connect to that make you feel like you're not alone in this world and that you have something that's valuable. I think that's something as well.
That makes me, think about how, Saturn exalts in Libra, and Libra's connected to Venus and your values. And so, Saturn is really about strengthening those values, what's important to you in your life, what's important to, what you stand on, what you defend. All right, cool. I think, during this podcast, we're going to talk about the cycles of Saturn and the movements of Saturn. And so for anyone that doesn't really know much about, transits and, what a Saturn return means, what a Saturn square means, it's based on the idea of transits, which is the idea of planets moving in the sky at the moment we are right now, and how that affects our birth chart. So when Saturn moves very slowly, so Saturn, you have your Saturn square when you're 7 years old. And so these are related to certain aspects, of course, that as Saturn moves through the sky, it's going to create certain angles and talk to your Saturn in different ways. So, when 7 years later, when Saturn, you have your Saturn square, Saturn is 90 degrees away from your natal Saturn and creates this square aspect, which is a little bit more forceful. There's more pressure, there's less of a choice, and less control over the things that are happening around this time. But we look at these aspects that Saturn is making to our natal Saturn to investigate these key points of our life, which have to do with maturing, growing up, taking care of responsibilities, and having to face the reality of life.
Absolutely.
So how would you, and I know you're really big on the cycles of Saturn, 7 year cycles. So how would you explain these cycles to someone?
So a lot of what I tend to do when I explain the Saturn cycle is, if you think of it as like a clock, like let's say you are 12 o'clock, right? That kind of like nexus point is where you start. And then your Saturn square is when it's 3 o'clock, right? And then that's that first one, right? And then you have, that's the age of 7 that you're referring to. And then it kind of keeps going. And then we have the 6 o'clock, which is where there's like that big kind of line divider kind of thing. And we'll kind of unbox these a little bit more in a second. And then after that, it goes to 9 o'clock.
And then you're kind of like, now you can kind of see that it's going to go to noon again or to 12. And then it goes to 12 and that's the Saturn return. So there's that, the 3 o'clock is that, that 7-year cycle. The 6 o'clock is that 14. And then 9 o'clock would be the 21. And then obviously 28 is that nexus, or essentially new origin point kind of thing. So that's a lot of how I look at it. It's just kind of like those cycles of 7, and every single time there is, and as we kind of move past the 7 return, there's obviously that same cycle when you go back to 3 o'clock, except there's a different, time and different experience, right? Different kind of refresher that Saturn did when it kind of returned to that new moment.
Exactly.
But there is that, just understanding that Saturn's always going to kind of reference back to that main point of your own Saturn. So at 7, 14, 21, those are all points of really big maturing related to your specific Saturn lesson. And so especially 21. 21 is a really big one because it's the one right before the Saturn return. So it's the last time Saturn's really going to really hit it home of where you need to really look at. And then obviously after that, we get to the other Saturn square. That's the whole thing we'll get in a second. But yeah, I think it's about that timing and those transits, like you had said, and knowing that they're coming up and knowing when they come up and knowing that that's part of literally the evolution of what we learn. Everyone at 21 is going to have that kind of cycle. Everyone at 14 is going to have that cycle. And so it's part of that evolutionary process that we all go through.
And I think it's way easier to understand these Saturn cycles by thinking about the ages, when they happen. So when we're 7 years old, we have our Saturn square, which is the first Saturn big cycle of our life. And some would say that's super young for Saturn to cause some things, but it's really a time in our life where we start going to school. We have teachers, we have to act a certain way, we have a code of conduct that we have to follow. We are starting to understand ourselves a little bit more, clarify our identity, and that might cause some friction with authority figures in our life. So around 7 years old, when we have our first Saturn square, it's really about how we're thrown into this external world, not just at home with our family, with people that we know, but these strangers, and how do we follow rules that they deem are the right ones.
I think the Saturn square is a very interesting time for a lot of parents too, because I happen to know someone who has a child that just went through their first Saturn square. They're about 8 now, but it was a very interesting thing because they say this too about children, that at the age of 7, they everything's kind of, I don't want to say pre-programmed at that point, but they're kind of they don't really remember everything. Everything up to 7 is really just impressed upon the child. And then at that 7 is when they really have that kind of programming set, and then they kind of move on from there. And it's interesting because for her in specific, my best friend has told me that her son just forgets stuff that she remembered him doing when he was 7 years old or prior to 7, because he just didn't remember. He doesn't have the capacity to remember that. And there's a very conscious kind of switch at 7 that at least I've seen with him, where now he's looking for more structure. Like you said, he's looking for more friends. He's looking to socialize. He's wanting to say, hey mom, I want to go do this. I want to go see this person. I want to have more of a relationship with with my father or with other kids, or just exploring other kind of role models. He's looking for some sort of role model that's different from what he's got, and that's something that we can see sometimes in the 7th is they go from that nurturing, caretaking thing that the mother did for those times, and what that kind of root was that they built. And then from there, they're then looking to be okay, I want to try this. I want to explore, doing karate, or I want to try art, or I want to try all these different interests, right? They're kind of exploring their own center of authority kind of thing.
Yeah. And of course, Saturn is going to bring in those negative feelings. It's going to bring in some anxiety. And I think, children do face separation anxiety when they have to go to school and they're not at home and protected by the people that usually protect them. And I think that reminds me of every Saturn cycle that we go to. There's, Saturn presents us these moments where we feel scared and fearful and we don't know what to do, but we're going to figure it out somehow. So it's these times of questioning yourself, right? But as I said, we always look back and see that clarity after it happens. And, I think that's something that should give people peace of mind that, you've been through so many Saturn aspects, you've been through so many Saturn cycles, and you've come out okay. Yes, it's been rough, it's been tough, but you're so much better because of it. And there's going to be times in life that it's going to press you a little bit, and it's going to ask a lot of you. And so these are moments of our life, though. These certain times, the Saturn return, it's 3 years about. So it really is temporary, and you just have to really lock in and understand, like, receive that Saturn energy, like, stop fighting it, and stop being so scared, like, receive it. Like, when I talk about my Saturn return, I felt like I had more control over my Saturn return because I was like, okay, I actually need to get my stuff together. I need to do this for myself. It wasn't like someone forced me to. Which is more like a Saturn square energy where you feel forced to do it. But I feel like maybe the Saturn opposition, the Saturn return is a little bit more like I'm realizing these things about myself.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think there's a lot of self-realization that comes, and even at 7, like that first Saturn square, like in the grand scheme of the life that entire child is going to live, is something that is very vast, and that's like the very beginning of that kind of like growth period that we all go through and we all have at 7. A lot of people at that point are like, oh, I'm just conscious, or I'm just getting my first memories, that sort of stuff, and you're really sinking into that. And I think it's something for those that may have kids that are around that age, or siblings or something to that effect, like knowing that, like, you don't need to put so much weight on that 7-year-old time because they're still 7, and it's just paying attention, I think, to what happens and just seeing kind of what those themes are that are kind of coming up, and kind of tracking it, not from a space of obsession and control, because that's another thing that's really something that people can do with Saturn, is they're so fearful that they like latch in and they try and like overly control it, and control all of what's happening, right? If they're seeing their son or daughters going through that, they're going to like try and be like, no, I don't want to do anything, right? And that can almost reinforce the fear of something in that regard, right? And so I think it's something that every Saturn cycle has an importance to it. And I think that's the 7-year one is something I've only had, like I said, like really that one experience on. But for those that have had kids and have kids around that age, it's something that I can imagine has that very like restructuring feel,
And I think even reframing it, like, it's a beautiful time. It's like it's when a bird kicks their babies out of the nest. It's like, go for it, face reality. But that's beautiful. It's like, it's a moment of upgrading and stepping up into a new level. And I think, when you're 7, that's the first time that happens, and it's going to be scary as a parent, right? To see that happen, to see that anxiety happen within them, or them of feeling pressure to be a certain person or to follow certain rules, but that's their first step into reality. And I think that's really beautiful. And I think we could all reframe Saturn cycles of our life to look at it that way. Like, it's a beautiful time where we are upgrading. We are becoming a better person. We are, taking accountability for our actions and just stepping into reality. And that's what life is all about, So it's beautiful as well, I think.
I think too, the only other point I want to add to that I find might be relevant is that typically a lot of people during their Saturn return typically also have children. And so what that would coincide with what we're talking about is that at that Saturn square for that child would also coincide with the parents' Saturn square post their first Saturn return as well. So that's something that has a lot of context, especially if you had a kid during your Saturn return. that there's a lot of, they kind of follow that same Saturn cycle as well. And there's a lesson within their Saturn cycles that links back to you in a lot deeper way, where you're going to be going through a different shift too. So I think there's a lot of context there. And especially because I've seen so many people have kids during their Saturn return, that it's relevant for that, especially for that 7-year-old kind of time frame. Yeah, it's something I really want to add.
Cool. Yeah. So then the next Saturn cycle is the Saturn opposition of age 14. Yep. So this is when Saturn is transiting. Saturn is 180 degrees away from your natal Saturn, and opposes it. And during this time, this is when you are a teenager. When you form an identity, you start to separate yourself from others, and you're in school, you're in sports, extracurricular activities, academic stress, academic pressure, you feeling like you need to fit in, and fitting into certain boxes and finding certain labels for yourself. Who are you? Finding your identity, like all of that moody, emotional turbulence that teenagers go through. Yeah. That's what that Saturn opposition brings in. And even puberty, right? Around this time, puberty happens, and I think it's like the first time where we're faced with the reality of time, and Saturn is time. Yes. And that we're growing up, and that we are changing, and we are to expect more changes.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's something where a lot of hormones are really, really shifting, and you see a lot with the Saturn opposition at 14. Kind of what you had said, where there's this like doing a lot of changes, going with different friend groups, doing all these different stuff and extracurriculars and things, and a lot of it too is the main premise of the Saturn opposition is looking outside of yourself for some sort of authority. And when it's at 14, you don't have much experience in time and life and knowing who you are at that point. And you're looking and outsourcing that authority typically. So this is where you'll see them, learning from teachers, and learning from their friends, and learning from, whomever. Like they're just kind of going around and trying to find and listen to people that are not just their parent or not just their primary caregiver, and they're learning more about, well, what does this person have to say? Where is this person pulling me in this direction? Where is this person pulling this direction? This is when you can see, obviously, children, especially at 14, whether it's Saturn or whether it's hormones, the kind of like fighting and the kind of back and forth and that angst that you can see at 14, where they're really they're getting that pushback from society or pushback from people. That's like, you don't act like that. You don't do that. And that's where you'll see a lot of that teenage angst is linked to
that rebellious energy. And it's, Saturn's about authority. So it's about what authority do you want to follow? How do you, look at authority, respond to authority, all that sort of stuff. And, with those emotions and all that stuff. And the Saturn opposition is very much like, okay, it's those questions. It's like you looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, okay, what am I here to do? What type of person do I want to be? Who am I? And the Saturn opposition, I feel like could feel like, to me, the energy feels dramatic, very, very, climax of a movie, these deep dramatic questions that you have about your life and yourself. And, I think, it could bring in a lot of that anxiety and even like loneliness in terms of feeling like you want to fit in, but if you don't fit in, and high school is very cliquey, right? So I think the Saturn opposition could talk a lot about that. What would you say to parents who are having children who are going through their Saturn opposition?
Good luck. Honestly, that's 14-year-old. I can't even imagine. I think it's really at that point about letting them find their own structure and build their own structure. I would really say, I think, once again, same point, like I said, if you had your kid during your Saturn return, that's obviously going to play into your own Saturn cycle. But outside of that, I think having, allowing them to explore their limits and find their limits. And obviously that's a very difficult time to be a parent of someone that's 14 years old, because like you said, they're really rebellious, they're doing all this stuff. So it's kind of like trying to find the right, really respecting them, I think, is a really big part of it. Like, because with that time period, there's so much stress that they're going through, so many hormone changes, so many life changes, so many things. It's kind of like they're shoved into the world and they're like, okay, figure it out. Right. And I think if you were a parent for someone at that age, like obviously your parenting style is different from every other parent, but you're going to want them to set up for success. So I think it's really about having that structure built, as much as you can as a parent with your own needs and own life prior to that, right, with your child, developing that really responsible relationship and that really respectful relationship, and ultimately respect your child at that age, because they're still figuring it out. And we've all been, if we're adults and having children, we've all been at 14 years old. We've all been at that point. And so I think it's giving grace. It's giving, patience with them as they're figuring it out, not trying to be so controlling and, put together and organized and force them to do something in specific, The other thing that's interesting is, Saturn. The other thing I want to add is that Saturn, at the age of 14 is something that in Eastern cultures, that's when they can start getting arranged marriages and those sorts of things, which is entirely wild to me. But I feel like it has some relevance for when they're at that age, you're like, oh, now they can, run a business, or they can work for me, or they can have a marriage. And that's a really heavy thing with some cultural expectations from other different cultures and lives. Like some people even were like, okay, you're 14 now, you can get married, you can go to war, you can do all these things, right? 14, 16, all that time. So I think that's something to think about when we have those expectations of kids at that time. And some countries still do. Some cultures still do. And I think it's about just respecting them through that process, within that time of their life, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why it's so important to raise your children with ways to cope with these stressful emotions, these challenging emotions through mindfulness or even therapy. Maybe 14, I guess that's a young age for therapy, but I guess it's a fine age for therapy, especially being that it is a Saturn opposition. So, why not? I was thinking more so the Saturn square of 21 is the perfect time to start therapy, because then you can process everything that you've been through and you're thrown into this world of adulthood more so. Yeah. Should we move on to the Saturn square of 21? So when you're 21 years old, Saturn transiting Saturn squares your natal Saturn, similar to when you were 7 years old. And but this is different because you're older, right? And this is a time where we are thrown into adulthood, where we have to think about money, our finances, saving, budgeting. I think this is when relationships get more intense and more serious. And Saturn has a lot to do, I think, with relationships and partnerships. I think Saturn exalts in Libra, that whole ordeal. And it's how do you commit yourself to another person? What does that commitment look like? How do you nurture that relationship? So I think when you're 21, it could bring in, it could be the first time when you have a very important relationship where you feel love for the first time. And it can really have you to think about, what type of partnership do I want to have? How do I want to commit myself to other people?
Agreed. I think too, at 21, there's a different level of, like you had said, responsibility with finances, things like that. I think a lot of people at that point have already finished college, have already, kind of gone through that process. And now they're either firmly in the workforce, or they're in trades, or they're, in, the army, or they're in something, or they're a homeowner, or they're a parent. There's people that can be parents at 21 years old. Plenty of people I know have been. And so there's so many things at that point that really, this is probably the one that I would recommend. Really, if you're obviously close to the age of 21, to really pay attention to that context of what comes up, because I think there's so much richness of context in that really gives you all of that kind of understanding of what to expect further and more clearly during your Saturn return, because you didn't have it during the first Saturn square. You did, but you weren't as super conscious at 7 in comparison to 21, and same with 14 to 21, So I think there's this really heavy responsibility, a lot of changes. People are like, okay, there's a really long uphill battle in my 20s, right? And sometimes people just want to hold on to their youth at 21, and they just want to kind of stay within that. And I think at that age, it's, this is also where, at least in America, where we're finally able to drink. And so you can see how that's something that I think is just culturally linked to Saturn, where it's like, okay, now you're responsible in a way that, you can go and drink, and you can now go to bars, and you have so much more freedom of choice, but obviously a lot more weight of responsibility with those choices. And that can set you up for a lot of success, and also a lot of, difficulties too, depending upon how you handle the responsibility that Saturn is bringing up at the time.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think, that's how I see it. I think the Saturn squares could be very external, while the Saturn opposition, Saturn return, can be a lot more internal. That's just how I look at it, because the Saturn square, you can't control that. The square aspect is going to happen, and you just you're thrown into adulthood. There's no choice there. This is a time where people move from school to work to having a job, and that has a lot to do with responsibilities and what do we want to do in the future, and what is our purpose. But we're forced to make these decisions about our future and what we want to do. So it's a big time where we have to get it together. We have to grow up. We have to do the right thing. And loneliness pops in, of course. Maybe sometimes people move away. They're at college, living away, or some people just move out from their parents around this time, perhaps. And so it could bring in that loneliness. It could bring in that, that anxiety or that depression. It's like, how do I do this all by myself?
Yeah.
And I think it reminds me a lot of the Saturn return in that way too.
I agree. And I think the other thing with that, we didn't really mention this earlier, but I think also Saturn does have connections to loneliness as well. So I think all of those periods have a sense of loneliness, but I think 21's a little bit more, because you have a lot more that you can lose, and also a lot more that you can gain at that point. So you can see people going in isolation and, really working really, really hard at that 21-year age, and they're setting up themselves for success. Or you can see people that are just throwing that away in responsibility and not aware of that. And I think if more people were aware of the Saturn cycles and aware that always at 14, 21, 7, all those things are always times that are going to be really bringing up things of okay, what do you do with this? You can do it. Right. And Saturn's always doing that, whether it's not at these exact key points anyway, wanting you to be responsible, but it is something that the context of those times is really important. And 21, huge deal, because you're kind of small fish in a big pond type of thing, really trying to be okay, I'm good, I got this. And then you go and you're wow, there's a big world out there that now I kind of can understand and have more context for. What do I want to do in it? What do I want to build in it?
I can look at each Saturn cycle as clipping a wire. Let's say, I don't know, you're a puppet, and there's the strings of a puppet, and it's each Saturn cycle is all right, we're clipping this wire, and I feel at 21 it's the second to last wire that's clipped.
Yeah.
And then your Saturn return is when that last wire is finally clipped.
Yeah.
And now you are your own person, and you have to do this for yourself.
Yeah. It can also be kind of, to tweak that analogy too. I think I really like that, but I think it's something as well that we could, because Saturn typically has to do also with restrictions and chains in regards. So kind of in that same vein, where it's kind of you have these weights on you, and at 7, right, those weights are slowly coming off as you're becoming more conscious. And 14, same thing. And then at 21, it's you only have one weight left, but it's the heaviest, hardest one, the weight is consistently kind of decreased, I guess, in that regard. And then at 21, okay, I just got to carry this one. This is the one I want to carry, that I want to commit to. And it is very freeing when you finally get to that Saturn return. Okay, I've been carrying this weight for so long, and it's so heavy, and it's such a hard thing to commit to, but I did it. And even if you didn't do it perfectly, no one does. No one understands it perfectly, even with astrology. And that's another thing. We can't predict every single way this is going to turn out. All we know is these are the timings, and these are what Saturn kind of works in those specific time frames, and it's going to give you context. But we can't, as astrologers, can't do the work for you as a client, and we can't give you all of the gifts because we're not in your Saturn, we're not in your chart. We can't live it like you can, and we don't have all the context that they do. And that's why I think it's really important to emphasize those times, especially 21, because there's so much within that that's so rich of context that you can use to set you up for success. Really. Yeah. Cool.
So talking about the Saturn return, this is where everybody gets tripped up, they get scared. It's a point of our life, like we said, how I said, all those wires get clipped. And so I can get how that's, very scary, and I'm going through it right now. So I totally get it. Yeah. But so when we're 29, that's when Saturn returns to the point that it was in our chart when we were born. So this is when Saturn is in the same sign as the sign that Saturn was born in your chart.
You got it.
My Mercury is retrograde, so
right.
it's like mix and match. But what do you think about the Saturn return? How would you start this off?
There's a lot there. I think with the Saturn return, there is so much of a loaded conversation about it, because I think so many people that have been through the Saturn return, and some people that even haven't been through the Saturn return, love to talk about it for different reasons. I think partially because it's something that is so relatable as a human experience, whether you've been through it or not, but it's also something of kind of coping with. Like I see a lot of people that are really looking at the information and kind of being like, okay, like if I'm prepared with the information of what's to come with my Saturn return that's down the pipeline, then I'm well prepared for it, and I'm going to be able to handle it. And other people on the opposite end, where they've finished the Saturn return, like myself, like we're at a point where like, okay, let's, like I said, set up other generations for success in that regard. So, but the Saturn return, yeah, I agree with what you said with the kind of the clipping of those things. And it's kind of like a free fall, right? It's a free fall. You have to catch yourself. You have to be that weight and you have to keep your center and kind of guide yourself, right? And I think it's something that is really, really powerful and potent. And Saturn is such such a powerful energy when you're able to utilize it and hold it. And during that Saturn return, it's really like, okay, I've been carrying this weight for so long, from 21 to 28. And now I'm like, really, like my muscles are good and I understand what I have to do now more. And it's only through really that, I don't want to say really through that final year, like 7 years, but during that time is where a lot of work's done, where you're setting a lot of foundation, and then the Saturn return comes out. Okay, now I know what I want to do. Now I know where I want to be. I know who I want to be. And I think that's where the Saturn return within the birth chart really can give a lot of context at that point, because that's where Saturn will be when you're in your Saturn.
Yeah, like the Saturn return is helping you to return to who you truly are inside, and to be real about that, to be honest about that. And your Saturn return is a completion of that cycle. It is completing that 28, 29 year cycle and saying, okay, it's giving you clarity about who you are and what you want to do and how you want to take on responsibility in this world. So there's clarity that comes after it, and it ends a story and it starts a new story, so it's almost like graduating,
It is. It really is.
And I think there's beautiful. It's like, when you're in school, like it's hard work. It's like a marathon of work. It's very Saturnian, of course, school, academics, but like, and then you graduate and you feel like you celebrate yourself and you step into a different world, right? A different story, a different chapter. So, your Saturn return is beautiful in that sort of way. This is a part of our life where we go through a lot of shifts, a lot of transitions in our career, in love, in family, in ourselves, and how we commit ourselves to our future, And so I think, when you have your Saturn return and it throws all of these challenges at you, you have to look at it as, like I said, you coming back to yourself and you knowing exactly what you need to do for yourself, for like your soul, not just what's fun and what feels good. It's like really thinking about what mark that you leave on history and what you want that mark to be.
Like what you want your legacy to be and that sort of stuff. That's a very much Saturnian thing, is the legacy that we leave and being able to ground within that. And I think what's really interesting is during the Saturn return, typically you'll see, and I can attest to it with my own Saturn return, a very quick or very solid change in your career in a way that is like, enough is enough. I can't deal with this anymore. Like I quit my job during my Saturn return. I went full time into a bunch of different things, obviously, but I put that faith in myself and I said, this is what I want to do. I want to have more autonomy over my life and more control. And I think that Saturn return really does that. It's something that A lot of people reach the peak of their career or really, really, like you said, at graduation, where it's like, okay, I'm here and I've now worked so hard and I've reached this point where I'm like, I know what I want to do next, or at least you're really setting that really solid foundation. It's like you're taking the whole foundation you've built and you might scrap it, you might change it, you might mold it, you might whatever, but now you're kind of like really like, okay, this is where I want to set my stone down. This is where what I want to work on. Let me build kind of the walls of this house, if you will, or the foundation of something, and kind of continue building my legacy. And a lot of the time during the Saturn return, we have a really good grasp, and Saturn gives us that good grasp and reality check of what we're meant to do in this reality and what we're meant to kind of really tune into and bring to the next generation and just in general, just to society, to benefit society.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very hugely potent time. And I talk about it all the time because it's something that when you live through it, you grow up so quick. And there's some people that now that I'm post my Saturn return, there's this like post Saturn return, like mindset of just like, oh, like, they don't get it yet. And that's okay. Like, it's okay they don't get it yet. They will. And that's part of that process. And it's like, now that you have wisdom, it's like, how do you utilize it to your benefit? And so, yeah, it's such a powerful time.
Yeah, I think, people are always like, how do I prepare for my Saturn return? That I feel like I don't have my stuff together. Saturn's gonna like whoop my butt. Like that's, and so what I would say to those people is that there's nothing that you really need to prepare for or do. Mm-hmm. I think it's really about experiencing, accepting, receiving Saturn.
Yeah.
And you're going to change regardless. Yes. And it's not something, it's something that I feel like is going to be more solid. Yeah. You're going to feel more confident about that change when it happens. Yes. And yeah, it might rip a lot of things out of your life that gave you comfort, certain relationships, certain habits, certain toxic behaviors that you may have. So it's going to do that, but it's cleansing you for this new chapter, this new story. And it's allowing you to have a more genuine relationship with yourself and a more rich experience of life. And I think we miss that part. We miss why is all of this stuff happening, and people get scared about that.
Oh yeah, they do. And I think it's something that with the Saturn return, people, like you said, they're like, oh, how am I going to prepare for this? Or you see on the other end, some people are like, oh, I'm super prepared for this. I can handle this. I can do it. And there's this overconfidence. And I think it's something that, like you had said, like let Saturn kind of come to you and work with it, because Saturn's going to do its thing regardless. When you're in your Saturn return, it's going to do it regardless. It's going to reform, reshape, all those things. And you really just have to push through it in the difficult times, and also really honor where you're at that point, and also be patient with the person that you're rebuilding within yourself, because it's a very inner rebuilding that tends to happen during that time, where you're restructuring stuff and you're really saying, this is what I want to do. This is who I am. And it's a beautiful time. It really is. This is where so many people change all of their lives in a matter of like a couple years. And it is so main character energy, intensely powerful. And I'm just I'm so grateful to have been able to go through it and to have that experience to bring to other people, because it's just like, you'll get through it. You'll be fine. Yeah. And if I could tell everybody, it's just like, you're going to be okay. Just be easy on yourself. Don't expect yourself to be, super, super burnt out and exhausted. Yeah, that's a part of it, but also don't expect yourself to just skate through it.
And don't limit yourself. I find the right word, like underrate yourself. Like, yes, agreed. You will be able to deal with it. Exactly. Like, you've been able to deal with so many things in your life. Yes. You're gonna figure it out. Don't be scared. Don't be fearful. It's, like I said, a beautiful time of letting go of things and having a more genuine life experience. So I hope that gives people, some peace of mind about the Saturn return.
Like, let Saturn come to you, like you said. I think it's a lot about what Saturn presents to you is what you can handle. It's very much that, what you can handle is what Saturn's going to say, okay, put this on your table. How are you going to deal with this? It's a test. It's a test, but it's a test of your resolve and your patience and all of what you've learned at all of those times. of like, what am I being presented with? What am I stepping into? And do I want to maintain this? And pay attention to all those things. And obviously you can get context with like your own natal chart and placement and all of those things, but which we're not going to obviously go into today, but it is something that gives a lot more further context outside of, well, at least for us, but outside of the context, the lived experience that that client may have or that person may have. That only they have. We can't be in their brain and be like, yeah, you've gone through this and this and this, right?
You can't prepare for the Saturn return, actually.
You can't. You really can't. I mean, it's something that you have to just go through, and you have to just go through the trenches, but also understand that through that process, it's like you're bringing in a new life. You're really, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's going to be positive. And you might not see it while you're in the thick of it, right? But once you're done with it, and even going into it knowing that, I think is such a liberating thing to know that it has its beginning and end point, which can alleviate stress or add stress, where it's like, I want to accomplish so much, but I also want to just have it be done, right? And you can't kind of have that. You're kind of like at both sides where you're like, oh, I don't really know, right? I've been there. Yeah. But then when it's done, you're like, okay, I've done everything I can do. Yeah. And I have to accept what I've done, what I can and cannot handle and stuff like that. So I think it's
tough.
I know.
It's sad. It's sad.
It's a grief process.
I was just going to say that you're grieving over a lost self.
Yeah. And a lost
and
potential.
Maybe even each Saturn cycle is grieving over,
it can be, over the previous.
A loss of innocence, a loss of support.
Oh yeah. And the amount of times I've said, which is something that I don't understand why anyone would want to say this ever as an astrologer, but the amount of times I've said that if I could go back to my Saturn return and kind of revisit it and do more, right? And kind of try more and push myself more. I would want to, because it's such a rich time of growth and opportunity that I'm like, I just wish I had that like back again for a moment. And that's very Saturnian as well too. Like post Saturn return, I'm like, oh, I wish I could go back and just take that time again and really make the most of it.
Like you said, potent. It's a potent feeling within yourself to say, no, I need to do these certain things for myself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I get that.
Yeah. It's a very much like, I wish now that it's over, I could go back to it. And that's where there's that grieving process where it's like, I've done all I can do. And obviously I have to be easy on myself. And we all have to do that, especially during and post and prior to the Saturn return. At all stages of life, be easier on yourself and expect yourself and see what you can handle. But I think also there's this looking back on Saturn that you tend to do after the Saturn return that has a very not somber, but a very like reality checking kind of way, like sustaining and kind of like pressure testing what you've built. And I think Saturn does that at all points, right? Whether it's looking back from Saturn return to the 21 Saturn square or further back and back and back, it's always kind of testing back to those points, which is once again, why that context is so important from the lived experience of what people have gone through at those ages.
Sure.
And it's like, I would say your grief is valid, don't feel like this is going to last forever, and don't feel like you have to be happy and you have to be on top of your stuff all the time. Saturn is going to push you a little bit.
Absolutely.
And so just allow yourself time to grieve these old ways that you've lived life. And you can cry, you can be depressed, you can be sad, but I know you can make it through it. And that's what Saturn believes in you as well. Just wants you to put in some elbow grease into it.
And believe in yourself too.
Yeah.
That's a lot of it. Believing in yourself that you can handle what's being presented to you and what you're going through and what you're wanting to put boundaries and restrictions or push yourself to try and do or accomplish or finish. That's a lot of it. Like the Saturn return is a lot about accomplishments and finishing things, because it's that return like birth point of like, okay, now I've done through all of this and now I'm ready to try something new or do this thing or cut this off or you know what I mean? So it's a really, really potent time. And I think it's something that I can't be grateful enough for my Saturn return. It was such a beautiful time in so many ways. And I'm sure you also feel that way now, but also you will definitely feel that way when it's finished as well. It's a very liberating feeling.
I feel it coming, but I feel like I just got out of war.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Like it's in chaos, you know?
It's like, I'm still traumatized.
Yeah, but that's part of what's presented to you as well. So it's liberating.
Yeah.
Because you're the one in charge of your own destiny, and that's kind of what Saturn return is about too. Like that kind of like empowerment of yourself and what you can and cannot accomplish, and what pushing yourself to accomplish more and try more. Yeah, it's really cool.
And so just to finish up the Saturn conversation, Saturn then you have your Saturn square again after your Saturn return. And that's 35. And then 42 is the Saturn opposition. 49 is the other Saturn square. So did you briefly want to touch on that?
Sure.
And, what that may look like? Or
So I obviously have not. I'm in between my Saturn return and my Saturn square, so I haven't reached that point yet. But my understanding of it from other people that I've spoken to and other clients that I've helped through this process is it is a lot more. There's a lot more context shoved into the Saturn return that we're able to understand when we get that second Saturn square, as opposed to the Saturn square at 21, where we're prepping for the Saturn return that we haven't had yet. There's so much context within a Saturn return that it's a lot easier to reference back to at that second Saturn square post Saturn return. So it's a lot of that time period where this is where I think a lot of people really step into a lot further authority, and they restructure all of what they had during their Saturn return. And that is actually something I'm very much looking forward to it for me, because like I said, that kind of grieving process of I wish I had more time with Saturn. And when we reach that time during that Saturn square at 35, it's a lot where we're able to look back at that and say, okay, did I build that right? How can I restructure it? How can I really re-understand my own thing and kind of maybe venture away from what you had started during that Saturn return? It's something that I've seen a few of my friends go through it, and it's not as hard as a Saturn return, and they've all kind of attested to that. It's not as difficult because Saturn return is that like really big rebirth, like Phoenix energy, that whole thing, and then Saturn square is like, okay, let's really look back at it and see. And it's still difficult and restructuring, but now you have a lot more strength that Saturn gave you during your Saturn return.
For sure. Yeah. So it's just important for people to know that it does not stop at the Saturn return. There's more Saturn cycles for you to go through. So I wish we could dive more into that during this podcast, but I think we're pushing the time a little bit.
We are. Here. Yes, I know. I know we have a lot to talk about.
But thank you, for spending time with me and this conversation. And
it's been really fun. It's very Saturnian.
Yeah.
Very Saturnian. And very Saturnian to put limits on it too. So I get that.
Right.
I think that's a very good kind of ending point too. So I think it's just important, like I said, to really give yourself grace and understanding and understand that you're the authority in all of this. And that's like a huge part, like knowing that you're the one in charge of how you respond to these things. And yes, it's going to be fearful. And there's going to be so much fear loaded into this from different social media outlets, just because of the way people, what gets views essentially, honestly. But it's something that if we're able to reframe it, and if hopefully the people that are watching are able to get that context of what they've lived and what they've survived and what they've been strong enough to get through, the Saturn return and every Saturn cycle thereafter, even for your children or anything to that effect, is something that they can handle and that you can handle if you just be patient with it, let it kind of come to you and assess from there and go through those tests, but know that like there's not really any wrong answer. It's all about testing your limits and knowing how you can handle something and how you're evolving and growing. So there's no wrong answer to it. It's just giving yourself grace, doing the best you can, and leaving the rest. That's really what I think is the gift of Saturn, is kind of like, okay, you've done this, that's cool, you tried your best, and then we get further Saturn cycles, and then it kind of revisits those things. But at the end of the day, that's all you can do, is try your best. Be as easy on yourself, be as light on yourself as you can, even though Saturn's really heavy. But I think really that's all I really have to kind of add, is like, just add a note. It's just be easy on yourself and be patient.
Yeah. My final piece of advice would be to think about how Saturn exalts in Libra. So reach out for help, talk to people, a therapist, a best friend, a parent, a family member, talk about your struggles with others. That's what Saturn does best in, with other people, not by yourself. Saturn and Aries,
Great.
So look out for help, look for support, reach out for support. You're not alone. You may feel alone, but we all go through this, and a lot of people have good advice to give you. So don't isolate yourself during these Saturn cycles.
Agreed. I very much agree with that. I just also think too, an added point with that kind of Saturn Libra exaltation with the Saturn Aquarius is lean into community as well. Lean into community, people that are friends, people that are able to support you as well. Lean into that part of about Saturn as well. And just kind of knowing that there's people out there that get it, or that are trying to get it, that are trying to help people through this stuff, and not always be super fearful and have all these high expectations of it and kind of instill fear in people. I think it's really about changing that narrative, changing that kind of perspective, because so many people go through the Saturn return fearful, stressed out, and they get out on the other side and they're like, okay, I did it. I'm cool. I didn't die. Nothing terrible really happened. I got through all of it and now I'm good. I can breathe. So just know that will come. That always comes. Lean into your people, lean into your support, lean into whomever you need that can help you through that process. I think that's a really, really, really important point, especially with mental health and the climate, how it is right now.
For sure. Cool. All right. Well, this is great.
Yeah, super fun.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you so much. And I mean, if anyone doesn't know, I was visiting Chicago for work for a week and happened to, you live here. And then we finally found time to do this podcast. And it was just really cool. So I appreciate you for sure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So it was really, really fun. I think there was so much that we could talk. We could have stuff about this forever, but Saturn's like limit stuff.
Yeah.
But I just appreciate it, and I really hope that if anyone has any pull to getting assistance from either of us, obviously, I think that's a really important key point, because with astrology we can see so much, and I think that's a very sensitive topic. And as we go through it, we could definitely just help people. And I'm just happy to do this. It's just super fun. That's the goal. It's just help people and reframe it and give that advice, honestly. So thank you.
Cool.